Beyond the Gates spoilers reveal that at Fairmont Crest, the most devastating decisions were rarely made in public. They were made behind closed doors, in rooms heavy with medicine and memory, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Death did not always enter like an intruder. Sometimes it arrived as a private thought, a quiet surrender, a signature waiting at the bottom of a page no one in the family was prepared to see. Long before the Duprees would speak the words out loud, something had already begun to shift inside the walls of their world. It was there in Anita's exhausted eyes, in the brittle silence that followed every encouraging lie, in the uneasy feeling that the family's greatest matriarch was no longer fighting only disease, but also the unbearable weight of what it meant to remain alive when living had become its own humiliation. What made it even more terrifying was that Anita's decision did not feel impulsive. It felt prepared. It felt like the final act of a woman who had spent her entire life controlling the shape of her legacy and had now reached the point where even death was becoming something she intended to manage on her own terms. And for Nicole and Dani, that possibility did not merely bring grief. It awakened fury, fear, and a deeper dread that the collapse of Anita's strength could tear open everything the Dupree family had spent generations trying to keep intact. By the time Anita let the idea settle into words, her body had already begun betraying her with a cruelty no one could soften. The treatments had not just drained her energy, they had stripped away the image she had built of herself over decades, elegant, commanding, untouchable. Illness had turned her into a woman who needed help standing, help resting, help enduring the hours that once belonged to her. For someone like Anita, that loss of command was almost more unbearable than the pain itself. She had not spent a lifetime becoming the center of her family only to be reduced to pity. Every sympathetic glance felt like an insult. Every hopeful reassurance sounded hollow. Even the love surrounding her began to feel like pressure. Because love demanded that she continue, love insisted on optimism, love refused to acknowledge what she alone had the courage to admit. She was tired in a way rest could not fix. She was no longer afraid of death as much as she was afraid of being forced to disappear slowly, while everyone she loved watched her become less and less herself. That was why the request for a do not resuscitate order carried so much more than medical meaning. It was not only a legal choice, it was a declaration. Anita was refusing to let the final chapter of her life be dictated by machines, panic, and other people's desperation. But in a family like the Duprees, where pride and devotion were woven together so tightly that neither could breathe without the other, that choice landed like a betrayal. Nicole was among the first to feel its full force. The shock that hit her was not simple sadness. It was sharper, angrier, more complicated. Nicole had always understood Anita as a woman of astonishing resilience, the kind of woman who could endure anything if the people she loved needed her to. To hear that Anita was preparing for a limit, naming a line she would not cross, felt like an emotional earthquake. Nicole told herself she wanted to respect Anita's autonomy, but respect became harder with every image that rose in her mind of a future where Anita stopped fighting, and the family was forced to live with the knowledge that she had chosen the terms of her own exit. Beneath Nicole's shock was another pain she could barely face. Anita's decision forced her to confront how much of her own identity still rested on the belief that the family's elders would remain standing no matter what came. Anita was not merely a loved one. She was structure. She was order. She was the living symbol that the Dupree name could survive humiliation, scandal, illness, and time. If Anita was ready to let go, then Nicole would have to imagine a future where the emotional architecture of the family no longer held. That possibility enraged her, because grief often wears the mask of moral outrage before it reveals itself as fear. So Nicole recoiled from the decision not just because she wanted Anita to live, but because she was terrified of what Anita's surrender might expose. Without Anita, old resentments would not stay buried. Family fractures would widen. The people who had leaned on her wisdom, her discipline, and her force of will would begin colliding without restraint. Nicole understood all of that at once, and it left her shaken in ways she could not confess. Dani's response was even more explosive, because Dani had always felt things as if emotion were weather moving directly through her body. Anita's choice did not strike her as noble or controlled. It felt cruel. It felt like abandonment dressed up as dignity. Dani could not hear the practical side of the conversation because she was too consumed by the emotional violence of what the choice implied. To her, Anita was not simply making a medical decision. She was deciding that the family would have to live with helplessness. She was deciding that they would be denied even the right to keep trying. Dani heard that as rejection, and the wound went deeper because it touched an old, unhealed terror inside her, the fear that the people she loved most would eventually grow tired of fighting their way back to her. That fear turned almost instantly into anger. What made the tension unbearable was that Anita, even weakened, remained fiercely clear-minded. She was not confused. She was not being manipulated. She had thought it through, and that certainty left Nicole and Dani with nowhere safe to place their frustration. They could not dismiss her judgment. They could not call it madness. They could only face the horrifying fact that Anita understood exactly what she was asking for. Her lucidity made their resistance feel selfish, and that only intensified the guilt simmering beneath the conflict. Because deep down, both women knew that some part of their outrage came from a place they were ashamed to name. They did not just want Anita to live for Anita's sake. They wanted her to remain because they still needed what she represented: strength, continuity, protection, permission to believe their family was still more powerful than the suffering pressing in around them. As the gravity of Anita's decision spread through the family, the question of legacy began poisoning every conversation. The Dupree name had always been larger than any one person, yet Anita had embodied it so completely that it became impossible to separate the woman from the dynasty. If she was preparing for death, then everyone else had to confront what would be left behind and what might be lost forever. Old insecurities surfaced fast. Nicole began thinking not only about grief, but about the moral burden of inheritance. What did it mean to carry on the family image when the woman who defined it was already releasing her grip? What did it mean if Anita herself no longer believed endurance at any cost was a virtue? Dani, meanwhile, spiraled into a darker place, suspecting that Anita's decision was not merely about illness, but about disappointment. She began to wonder whether the family's hidden fractures, the selfishness, the emotional failures, the compromises and betrayals none of them could fully erase, had contributed to Anita's exhaustion. The thought was unbearable, yet impossible to dismiss. If Anita was ready to stop fighting, then perhaps the family itself had become part of the reason. That suspicion sharpened everything into accusation. Nicole and Dani, both already raw with fear, began clashing over what Anita really needed. Nicole tried to hold herself together through reason, but her composure was brittle and punishing. She wanted order, consultation, medical opinions, a framework that could keep emotion from taking over. Dani saw that as coldness. She saw it as another attempt to reduce Anita's suffering to something manageable, something clinical, something the family could control rather than feel. In Dani's mind, Nicole's restraint became its own kind of cruelty. But Nicole, looking at Dani's volatility, saw recklessness that would only place more pressure on a dying woman. Their grief moved in opposite directions and turned them into adversaries at the exact moment they should have been united. Every look between them carried blame. Every silence thickened with things they did not dare say in front of Anita. Anita saw all of it. That may have been the most painful part. Even in weakness, she recognized the emotional wreckage her decision was causing, and there were moments when the guilt nearly broke through her resolve. She hated the sight of Nicole trying to stay strong while silently unraveling. She hated Dani's wounded rage because it reminded her how fiercely her family still loved her, how much damage her absence would do. But those moments of softness did not erase the larger truth driving her. Anita had reached a point where survival was no longer synonymous with living. The pain was constant, the indignities relentless, and beneath it all was a quieter grief that no one around her fully grasped. She was mourning herself before anyone else had the courage to. Mourning her body, her independence, the authority with which she once moved through the world, the glamorous certainty that had once defined her. She was not choosing death in a theatrical spirit of despair. She was choosing not to let the final violence against her dignity come from desperate hands refusing to let her go. Still, once the possibility of a signed order entered the room, everyone began reacting from their worst instincts. Nicole started watching everything more closely, torn between honoring Anita and searching for any sign that might justify intervening. That internal split filled her with shame because it exposed how fragile her principles became when the person at the center of the decision was someone she could not imagine losing. Dani, unable to bear passivity, pushed harder, emotionally harder, spiritually harder, almost as if sheer force of feeling could drag Anita back from the brink of resignation. But pressure only deepened Anita's exhaustion. The more they tried to pull her toward their hope, the more isolated she felt inside her own suffering. A terrible loneliness settled over her then, because the people who loved her most could not stop turning her final choice into a referendum on their pain. What made the situation feel truly tragic was that no one was entirely wrong. Anita had the right to decide how much more she could endure. Nicole was right to fear the collapse that would follow. Dani was right to feel the decision as a profound wound. Yet truth did not bring peace. It only made the conflict more painful because there was no clear villain, only love turning savage under pressure. The family's devotion, once their greatest strength, now became the thing tearing them apart. Every person in the room believed they were protecting something sacred. Anita believed she was protecting her dignity. Nicole believed she was protecting the family from irreversible loss. Dani believed she was protecting the emotional bond that had always held them together. In the clash of those convictions, tenderness began curdling into resentment. And beneath the immediate storm was an even darker implication neither Nicole nor Dani could ignore. If Anita was ready to face death, then the Dupree legacy itself stood at the edge of transformation. Her absence would not simply create grief, it would create exposure. The balance she maintained would vanish. Long-managed tensions would surface. The family myth of invincibility would crack. Fairmont Crest had always seen the Duprees as powerful, polished, and nearly unbreakable, but Anita's decline was revealing the truth they had spent years disguising. Even the strongest families can be destroyed not by scandal alone, but by the private agony they do not know how to survive together. By the end, what remained hanging over all of them was not merely the question of whether Anita would sign the order. It was the realization that, in preparing to choose the limits of her own suffering, she had forced every person who loved her to reveal the limits of their own strength. Nicole's control began to fracture under the weight of fear. Dani's passion veered dangerously close to emotional collapse. Anita herself, even in conviction, could not entirely escape the heartbreak of watching her final act of agency become the source of her family's greatest torment. What should have been a private and sacred decision had become a reckoning, exposing old wounds, hidden dependencies, and the unbearable truth that love does not always know how to let go with grace. And that was the real catastrophe now approaching the Dupree family. Not simply illness, not simply the threat of death, but the possibility that Anita's willingness to face the end would tear open everything her life had once held together. If she signed that order, it would not only mark a boundary for medicine, it would mark the beginning of a new era of grief, accusation, and instability for everyone left behind. In that sense, Anita was not merely confronting mortality. She was standing at the center of a family disaster no amount of wealth, pride, or history could prevent. And the people around her were beginning to understand, with growing horror, that the true tragedy might not be losing her body first. It might be watching the Dupree family lose its soul while she was still alive to see it happen.